three men whose crimes shocked the world. Behind their ordinary appearances lurked unimaginable horrors. But who were they, really? Number 1. In the late 1980s, Milwaukee was a city like any other, where people went about their daily routines, unaware that something horrifying was brewing beneath the surface. A young man disappeared after a night out, leaving behind only questions and a worried family. Friends described him as outgoing and trustworthy, someone who would never simply vanish. Yet, he was gone without a trace. His last known interaction was with a quiet, unassuming man, offering drinks and friendly conversation. Little did anyone know, this encounter would be the key to a nightmarish revelation. But who was this man, and how had he eluded suspicion for so long? Jeffrey Dahmer was, to most, just an ordinary man. He lived in a modest apartment, held down various jobs, and kept mostly to himself. Neighbors described him as polite, if a bit odd, but nothing about him screamed danger. His apartment was like any other, except for the occasional foul smell that some dismissed as spoiled food. He worked quietly and blended into his surroundings. But beneath this facade, Dahmer harbored terrifying desires. He preyed on vulnerable men, luring them in with the promise of companionship or alcohol. Once inside his apartment, these men would never leave. What kind of secrets was this quiet man hiding? In July 1991, Dahmer's carefully constructed world came crashing down when one of his victims escaped. A man, half naked and bound in chains, ran through the streets of Milwaukee, desperate for help. He flagged down 2 police officers and led them back to the apartment he had fled from. The officers were skeptical but followed him inside. What they found was beyond anything they could have imagined. Polaroid photographs depicting dismembered bodies, human remains stored in freezers, and horrifying tools used to carry out unspeakable acts. The man who stood before them was no longer the quiet neighbor they knew. He was a predator, but could anyone comprehend the extent of Dahmer's horrors? As police investigated Dahmer's apartment, the full scale of his atrocities became clear. He confessed to a string of brutal murders spanning over a decade. Dahmer's crimes were more than just killings, they were acts of extreme depravity. He admitted to dismembering his victims, performing twisted rituals, and even consuming parts of their bodies. His obsession with control over his victims extended beyond their deaths, leading him down a path of necrophilia and cannibalism. Each crime had been carefully planned, with Dahmer selecting men he believed no one would miss. His quiet demeanor allowed him to evade capture for years. How had this monster hidden in plain sight for so long? Jeffrey Dahmer's trial shocked the world. Despite his heinous acts, he appeared calm and composed as he recounted his crimes, offering no real defense other than his uncontrollable urges. He pled guilty but insane, but the jury rejected his plea, finding him fully responsible for his actions. Dahmer was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. While in prison, he expressed remorse and claimed to have found religion, but for many, this offered little solace. In 1994, Dahmer was killed by a fellow inmate, bringing a violent end to his already dark life. Milwaukee could finally breathe a sigh of relief, but the question remained: how many more could there be like him, hiding in plain sight? Number 2. In the early 1970s, young women in California began disappearing, but there were no signs of foul play or struggle. College campuses seemed safe, yet fear slowly crept in as news of missing students spread. The police were baffled, unable to find any leads. It wasn't until bodies started being discovered in remote areas that the nightmare became real. Each victim had met a horrifying end, their lives taken by a predator no one saw coming. The community was gripped by terror, but the real horror lay in who the killer was, a man already familiar to law enforcement. But how could such a predator remain hidden for so long? Edmund Kemper was not the typical image of a serial killer. At 6 feet 9 inches tall, his imposing figure might have made him noticeable, but he managed to blend into society. He seemed like a gentle giant, an intelligent man who often hung around with local officers at a bar in Santa Cruz. He was polite, respectful, and even called the police his friends. No one could have guessed that this mild-mannered man had an insidious secret: he had already killed before, at just 15 years old. How did a teenager turn into one of America's most infamous killers? Kemper's journey into darkness began early. Born to a broken home and raised by an abusive mother, he endured years of emotional torment. His mother, who resented him, locked him in the basement, away from his sisters, fearing he might harm them. By the time he was 15, Kemper's rage boiled over. He murdered both his grandparents in cold blood, claiming he wanted to know what it felt like to kill. Sent to a mental institution, he was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic but was released at 21, deemed no longer a threat. How did someone with such a past slip through the cracks? After his release, Kemper seemed to be on a path to recovery, but darkness still festered beneath his surface. His relationship with his mother deteriorated further, and his need for control grew stronger. In 1972, he began picking up young women who were hitchhiking, pretending to give them rides. His victims were always college students, innocent and unaware of the true danger they were in. Kemper would take them to remote areas, where he unleashed his monstrous tendencies, abducting, murdering, and dismembering them. But what drove him to commit such unspeakable acts? Despite the horrific nature of his crimes, Kemper continued to go unnoticed, even befriending local law enforcement. They had no idea that the man they shared drinks with was the very monster they were hunting. His murders continued until April 1973, when he turned his rage toward the one person who had tormented him throughout his life, his mother. In a gruesome and symbolic act, he killed her and then her best friend. This final act of violence seemed to satisfy a dark need within him. But could anyone have predicted what he would do next? After the murder of his mother, Kemper did something that stunned everyone. He turned himself in. He called the police from a phone booth and confessed to all of his crimes. When officers arrived, they were horrified to discover the gruesome aftermath in his home. Kemper's detailed confession left them speechless, as he calmly recounted the chilling acts of violence he had committed over the years. How could someone so monstrous show such calmness in admitting his guilt? Kemper's trial was a formality, as his own admissions sealed his fate. Found guilty of 8 counts of murder, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Today, he remains behind bars, a living reminder of the terror that gripped California during his killing spree. While Kemper has since expressed remorse for his actions, his horrifying legacy endures, cementing him as one of history's most infamous serial killers. Though justice was served, his story leaves one unsettling question: how many more are hiding in plain sight? Number 3. In the quiet suburbs of Chicago during the 1970s, teenagers began to disappear without a trace. Families reported their sons missing, but leads went cold. These young boys, many from troubled backgrounds or just looking for part-time work, seemed to vanish into thin air. Panic spread as each case bore disturbing similarities, yet the police struggled to connect the dots. How could so many boys disappear so suddenly, and who was behind it? John Wayne Gacy was the last person anyone would suspect. He was a respected businessman, known for his charity work and involvement in local politics. Gacy often dressed as Pogo the Clown to entertain children at parties and charity events. To his neighbors, he was a model citizen, always ready with a smile or a helping hand. But behind that friendly facade lay a monster. In his basement, Gacy concealed a horrifying secret, a brutal pattern of abduction, torture, and murder. He preyed on young boys, luring them to his home with promises of work or friendship before subjecting them to unimaginable terror. How could such a well-liked man be capable of such unspeakable evil? It wasn't until 1978, when 15-year-old Robert Peast went missing after a job interview with Gacy, that suspicions began to focus on him. Peast's disappearance was different. His parents were determined to find answers. Investigators soon learned that Gacy was the last person to have seen the boy alive. When police searched Gacy's home, they found something that would break the case wide open: strange odors coming from the crawl space beneath his house. Could this local businessman really be behind the string of unsolved disappearances? With growing suspicion, police obtained a warrant to dig deeper, literally. What they unearthed would shock the world. In the crawl space beneath Gacy's home, they found the remains of multiple young boys. The bodies had been buried in shallow graves, stacked upon each other. Gacy's secret was finally out. He was one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history. In total, 29 bodies were discovered on his property, with 4 more found in nearby rivers. The sheer scale of his killing spree was unfathomable. How had Gacy managed to keep this deadly secret for so long, right under everyone's noses? When confronted with the evidence, Gacy admitted to his crimes. He told police how he would lure boys to his house, often performing a trick by handcuffing them, pretending it was all in good fun, before torturing and killing them. His calm demeanor as he recounted these horrific acts left investigators stunned. Gacy showed no remorse, insisting that his victims had asked for it. His chilling detachment from his atrocities made him one of the most terrifying figures in modern criminal history. How could someone so normal-looking be capable of such incomprehensible cruelty? In 1980, Gacy was sentenced to death for the murder of 33 young men and boys. He spent 14 years on death row, during which time he infamously took up painting and continued to insist on his innocence. On May 10, 1994, Gacy was executed by lethal injection. The families of his victims, though grateful that justice had been served, could never fully recover from the loss of their loved ones. Gacy's story is a sobering reminder that true evil can hide in plain sight, even behind the mask of a clown. How many more people like Gacy walk among us, unnoticed and unsuspected?